Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, could, let's see, how do we go from, oh, you have the clicker. Yeah, could you just, yeah, go to the next one then. Oh, okay. The last, sorry, now could you go back? I beg your pardon. There we go. Because what I'm going to say here draws fairly heavily on this paper that you see in front of you, and it has a fairly short executive summary if you're interested in looking at it. The URL for it is very long, so I just put down 3 keywords for Google in case you should be interested in looking at it. And I would also like to express appreciation for colleagues from the DAC Secretariat working on environment who gave me some very good ideas for this talk as well. So next, thanks. Okay, what are the objectives of external financing for climate change? Adaptation, maximize sustainable development subject to constraints and risks of climate change. Mitigation, maximize mitigation of the release of greenhouse gases. In both cases, as in development in general, what countries do is much more important than what donors do. And it's really this straightforward point that's at the heart of the 8 effectiveness principles of the Paris Declaration and the Accra Agenda for Action. Well, why have I said this, raised things that go without saying, particularly for a group that's quite interested in climate change, and one can argue about definitions, but well aware of what the definitions are. And the reason is, I think it's important because starting with the next slide, we'll see how if you keep looking back at these overarching objectives, you'll find there are important implications for architecture, for allocations, for effectiveness, and for governance. Next one, please. Now, I know that there's some disagreement with whether the Paris-Accra principle should apply to climate financing, because there's a great concern about keeping climate finance separate from aid. And say, well, that's not aid. But the principles of effectiveness apply broadly to external financing, whether you call it Fred or Sam or whatever. Country ownership is really the key principle. There's a need to integrate a strong climate change lens into development strategies, to investment programs, and frameworks for results and mutual accountability. In fact, Neil Bird and colleagues here at ODI recently wrote something on this. One of the major lessons of aid effectiveness is the recognition that national ownership over the development process is paramount. This suggests that one-off project interventions supported by external finance that are not embedded within some national priority-setting process are unlikely to succeed. In fact, by working outside of national systems, some development projects have tended to undermine national systems. And work by Tom Mitchell and others has found a tendency for donors working on climate change to support climate proofing of development investments, in effect trying to roll back climate change rather than to adapt to it. Rather, as in other sectors, if donors are serious about maximizing impact, they should be helping to strengthen and provide broad programmatic support for country programs. And in many cases, certainly not all this is going to mean budget support, and that support should preferably finance overall development programs that have a strong climate lens. And as the volume of climate financing rises, donors should be quite wary, particularly in adaptation, of introducing inter- or intra-sectoral distortions that unnecessarily set back achievement of other development objectives. Richard has really already talked about this. Next one, please. Now let's turn to allocations. Whether climate funding is aid, it has to come from somewhere. And that somewhere looks to be getting more constrained as donor nations face continuing needs to reduce budget deficits. Happily, the UK is at this point a significant exception. So if additionality, again, outside the UK, but in general, is not what we'd like it to be, the real question is the overall architecture of concessional financing, not just the architecture of climate finance, because there's a pretty high degree of substitution between the two. Now, as Richard, in effect, was saying, vertical versus horizontal funding is not a question of good and evil, but of optimum portfolio shares. The objective is to equalize net benefits on the margin between overall development and climate change, and between, say, the Green Climate Fund that Nick was talking about, and more specialized funds. Well, that's pretty easy to say, but it's pretty hard to measure. Vertical programs have big pluses and big minuses, and it's harder yet to resist the strong vertical tide. Vertical programs clearly have strong public and political appeal. Next, please. Well, now for country allocations, virtually all horizontal and vertical donor funding seeks to maximize impact. There's no one panacea. Rather, there's a wide variety of approaches in other sectors, as in climate change, on how funding is allocated across countries. There's the challenge fund, the competition through competitive bids, which is very well suited to innovation and to piloting, but in my view should be avoided for sustained partnerships, particularly where recurrent costs are high. The list of reasons is a long one. It's highly unpredictable for the country, tends to encourage fragmentation. It's gameable. Consultants who know what the fund is looking for in the way of a nice presentation can help change the odds. There's pretty high cost and waste, particularly for proposals that don't get chosen. And the net result is that countries, in addition, countries that have small populations end up with financing per capita in practice, a multiple of that of middle-sized or larger countries. Richer countries, which have higher cost projects, end up with more per capita as well. Then there's results-based financing, which Nick mentioned, good incentive effects, but it's tricky to maximize results over time rather than the short run. And there's an awful lot of different ways of doing results-based financing, which not going to be able to get into. But by itself, it doesn't determine allocations across countries. Then we get ex-ante country envelopes. And these can be based on maximizing climate-efficient, poverty-weighted development. One way to do that is with the kind of allocation, of a resource allocation approach that the Jeff uses, which was based on that used for IDA, and that takes consistent account of population, of environmental importance, in the case of mitigation, poverty, and of predicted effectiveness in using funds, proxied by indicators of past performance. And these country envelopes can readily be adjusted also to give more to so-called donor orphans. Now, it seems to me that an attractive option is hybrids, building on contingent country envelopes. You give an idea about how much we have, but it can vary. It can vary according to the quality of strategies and programs, vary according to results, make part of it results-based, and funds that are not used then go back into the general pot. And there's obviously a stronger case for country envelopes and hybrids in funding adaptation than mitigation, but it's also applicable to some extent to mitigation as well, recalling that what countries do is more important than what donors do. And in choosing what is the right way to allocate, it's important to match up the allocation mechanism to the capacity of the governance structure. Take strong governance and capacity to pick winners successfully. Next, please. Well, I'm going to go quickly over private financing. Clearly, we need to seek high leverage in climate finance because of the magnitude of the requirements and already the importance of the private sector financing in energy and other climate-related financing. And private financing, as Nick's noted, is of overwhelming importance for a great many countries, all the middle-income countries and some of the lower-income ones. It's pretty clear that that countries need a favorable and predictable policy framework. There was a recent ODI background note by Jessica Brown and Michael Jacobs on leveraging private investment. They said simply the primary requirement to attract private sector capital into low-carbon investments is an appropriate policy framework. There also needs to be a regulatory framework and enforcement to increase accountability and mitigate corruption. There's a new report from Transparency International on it's the Global Corruption Report on climate change, looking at experience to date in carbon markets. Makes this case quite strong, the importance of dealing with corruption. And there was a World Bank publication on governance that said, the opportunity for corruption is a function of the size of the rents under a public official's control, the discretion that official has in allocating those rents, and the accountability that official faces for his or her decisions. Well, we're talking big-time rents and discretion here. And as ODI, the ODI background note I referred to had a number of specific suggestions as to what can be done to help the private sector. And if you look at each one, you say, wow, great idea, we really need to do it, but we need to make sure of the regulatory framework. For the aid-dependent countries, it's important that this kind of support for private sector leverage be considered along with other competing uses of the donor funding and be a part of the country allocation. Finally, on governance and incentives. Donors are not the only ones who suffer from inconsistent behavior on vertical programs. It applies to multilaterals, to developing countries, civil society, and the private sector. Richard already referred to how different ministers see things differently. Well, why is that? And the best explanation, I think, is Miles' Law, which all of you have heard of without that name. Where you stand depends on where you sit. So it depends on where you sit across organizations, but also within organizations. Not just whether you work for a donor, government, or an NGO, but whose interest does your part of your organization see itself defending? There's a strong trend in global programs toward governance that includes beneficiary countries and civil society. But as Nick has said, it's not as simple as that. There are issues to be managed, including conflict of interest, problems of lack of interest or experience in principles of effectiveness or accountability, for example. So donors and other stakeholders should take care when setting up vertical funds and take responsibility for the governance structures that they helped establish for them, rather than just complaining about what those lousy global funds or vertical funds do. And finally, it is surprising to say the least, that donors do not yet have an established forum for considering issues of global or vertical funds or of multilaterals in general. Although DFID's transparency on its multilateral aid review provides a great potential catalyst for doing so. And in this context, it'd be useful to have agreed principles of climate change finance, which we do not have now. The Busan High-Level Forum this fall offers a very good opportunity for DFID and for others to try to catalyze action on both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul.